in parallel with Rick Ross's direct influence on the law enforcement operation. Other representatives of the anti-cult group carried out destructive media activities. They appeared as cult experts on various TV channels and intentionally promoted a demonized image of the Davidians in public opinion. One of the representatives of the anti-cult group was Stephen Hessen, whom we mentioned earlier.
So he would take people for hours and hours and hours and mesmerize them through hypnosis, through behavior modification techniques and such, and break down their ability to think.
These were the people that we saw over and over in the media as support for the government's stories that the Branch Davidians were some evil cult. Mark Bro is the person who contacted the State Department and the Cult Awareness Network and relayed his allegations. Cult Awareness Network, known by its initials, CAN, targets religious groups around the world for hate campaigns in the media. CAN members always make the same allegations against each group they attack: perverted sex, child abuse, and brainwashing. It reads like a worn-out script. It has been repeated so many times against so many different groups.
The people who lived at Mount Carmel, including children, were never presented to the public as personalities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't share with the media the videos of the Davidians recorded during the siege, so that Americans wouldn't regard them as human beings, feel sympathy for them, and stand up for them. According to James T. Richardson, a sociologist of religion, the dehumanization of those inside Mount Carmel, coupled with the thoroughgoing demonization of Koresh, made it easier for those in authority to develop tactics that seemed organized for disaster. Thus, not only law enforcement officers, but also the public developed a false image of what was really happening in Waco.
And again, you get that demonization. It's like, these are people. As the Davidians were people. The people that died at Mount Carmel were people. They've never been truly humanized until they did the Waco series.
The reason behind all that was going on was one factor that back then neither federal law enforcement agents nor U.S. intelligence officers took into account. This detail, which had a fateful impact on the outcome of the events in Waco and remained unknown to this day, was that representatives of anti-cult organizations used hidden manipulative technologies to influence people's consciousness and subconsciousness. Such information messages that are built on the knowledge of these special psychotechnologies and contain hidden imprints able to bypass critical analysis by consciousness and penetrate directly into the depths of the human subconsciousness were repeatedly disseminated in the media for this very purpose. The anti-cultists needed a large-scale campaign for demonizing the Branch Davidians, and that's why they invested so much effort in dissemination of their false accusations. Therefore, absolutely different articles and videos in seemingly unrelated media contain the same repetitive narratives. Basically, all of this was part of the anti-cultist strategy of psychological manipulation of the public. In fact, anti-cultists were accusing others of what they themselves were actually doing, for they were the ones who were applying mind control and brainwashing techniques. In this way, using methods of psychological influence on the masses with the help of the media, the anti-cultists literally zombified the American people. They intentionally dehumanized the Branch Davidians to instill in people's consciousness a picture that the Davidians were dangerous and harmful to society, although in fact, the most dangerous at that time were the anti-cultists themselves. For the first time, they carried out such a large-scale terrorist act that was repeated in the information field multiple times and had a tremendous impact on all those who had fallen under its attack. As a matter of fact, all people who in one way or another were exposed to the information sourced from anti-cultists ended up infected with hidden destructive imprints. Americans who were following the events in Waco via television or newspapers at that time were subjected to coercive psychological manipulation by the anti-cultists. That's why the majority of people began to believe the descriptions that dehumanized the Davidians and accepted the picture of events presented by anti-cultists as a fact. They had no chance to resist this kind of manipulation, against which virtually the entire population of the planet is defenseless. The hidden manipulative influence by the anti-cultists similarly affected ATF, FBI, and other law enforcement officers, as well as government officials who participated in the Waco events and were in direct close contact with the anti-cultists. The officials were subjected to the highest degree of psychological manipulation and were literally brainwashed by the anti-cultists, so they acted unlawfully against law-abiding American citizens and committed a blatant violation of basic democratic human rights and freedoms. For this very reason, law enforcement officials manifested inhuman aggression against the Davidians, ignoring common sense and rejecting an opportunity for a peaceful and fact-based resolution. In turn, the Davidians developed an impression that the federal agents who encircled Mount Carmel were trying to kill them, and today there is considerable evidence that their fears and perception of events were not unfounded.
Listen, Jim, there's nothing that hurts me more than being called a cult leader, all right? If I'm wrong, people like me don't deserve to live, okay?
Listen.
You understand me, Jim? No. You know, don't burn our building down.
No, we won't do that.
Don't shoot us all up. They've got to have that time.
The strange behavior of law enforcement officers and their excessive belligerence towards peaceful citizens who showed no resistance was noticed by experts who hadn't been zombified by anti-cultists and arrived on the scene as consultants. Seeing what was happening, soberly assessing the situation, and foreseeing what the use of aggressive tactics against the Branch Davidians could lead to, they offered quite logical and reasonable options for resolving the conflict in a nonviolent way. But they were not listened to because those in power had already been programmed by the anti-cultists into the violent scenario. The representatives of law enforcement agencies and authorities were sure they were doing the right thing and were acting in an absolutely lawful manner. After all, they believed they were facing enemies, not law-abiding citizens.
I thought the main problem was going to be understanding the psychology of the people inside the compound. But as I got into it, I quickly became aware that the psychology of the people outside the compound was more important to an understanding of what happened. They needed to take control. And the tactical people in particular needed to show him who's boss.
We are trying to reinforce to them that we are in charge of the situation, that the compound is under the complete control of the government. It is in fact no longer their compound, that we have the ability to exercise whatever control we want over that compound, and we will do that from various times to demonstrate to them the fact that they are impotent in their ability to control their everyday lives.
I'm prepared to share David Koresh's contention that we should wait on God to resolve this. The FBI is God. It's going to decide how this is going to be resolved.
The federal agents in charge of the operation were confident that they were in control of the situation, but this firm conviction was in fact an illusion instilled by the anti-cultists. In reality, they were no longer in control. It's the anti-cultists who had originally created this situation and held the levers of control. Such manifestations of abnormal behavior are clear signs that perception of all these people had already been distorted at that time by the manipulative technologies of subconscious suggestions used by anti-cultists.
The FBI also employed aggressive psychological tactics during the Waco siege to supposedly force the besieged to voluntarily leave the building. Water and electricity supplies were cut off. Powerful floodlights were aimed at the ranch windows, shining around the clock to prevent the people inside from sleeping. Loudspeakers continuously blared irritating noises and high-volume music. A tank was brought in to clear the area around the building, crushing cars and nearby structures. Clearly, the mere presence of military equipment had a strongly demoralizing effect on the people inside the building.
If they thought that we were all brainwashed and such a bunch of crazies, why would the FBI push David or the rest of us to the limit? Why would you bombard the building day and night with lights and music and noises and wear these people out not knowing how they're going to react.
These pieces of equipment were unarmed, as I understand it, and were contracted. I mean, it was like a good rent-a-car.
A good rent-a-car? A tank going into a building?
Why did the FBI use such methods against peaceful Davidians? Who was behind plotting the tactics of aggressive psychological influence on the besieged people? It's an established fact that the stress escalation strategy employed by the FBI was based on the recommendations of Rick Ross and his accomplices. Moreover, further investigations revealed that the FBI followed the advice of anti-cultists and applied to the Davidians' typical deprogramming techniques, including depriving Koresh and his followers of food, water, and sleep, and repeatedly exposing them to excruciatingly disturbing sounds. In other words, the tactic of aggressive psychological attack on the Davidians was nothing but an attempt of mass deprogramming. It means that the anti-cultists, who had mastered their skills of physical and psychological violence on individuals, in the case of the Davidians, made an attempt to deprogram a whole group of people. This proves that sabotage of peace talks and protracted siege of the building were originally instigated by the anti-cultists, who sought to put an end to the activities of the Branch Davidians by first exposing them to psychological pressure. And when it became obvious that deprogramming methods failed, and on the contrary, only united the people inside the building, the situation took a fatal turn.
The catalyst for initiating the forceful stage was the unfounded conclusion by FBI agents that there was no reason to believe the Davidians would leave the building voluntarily. This was reported to the U.S. Attorney General. It is worth noting that throughout the siege of Mount Carmel, it was repeatedly observed that the actions of the tactical team of federal agents sabotaged the work of their colleagues in the negotiating team. The goal of the negotiators was to build rapport with the Branch Davidians in order to gain their trust. In contrast, the tactical team's efforts were aimed at intimidation and harassment. The negotiators themselves noted that such aggressive tactics undermined their own attempts to gain Koresh's trust and achieve a peaceful surrender of the Davidians. Moreover, the FBI actually made their statement that further negotiations were pointless after an agreement had been reached between their agents and the leader of the Davidians, David Koresh, that all of the Davidians would voluntarily leave the building immediately after Koresh would write his interpretation of the 7 seals of the apocalypse.
Definitely, those people were perfectly aware that the law enforcement officers intended to stop the activities of the Branch Davidian as a religious group. They realized that as soon as they would exit the building, they would be immediately arrested, and their children would be taken away by social services. Despite that, they agreed to come out, while the media promoted the anti-cultist mindset that Davidians were an allegedly dangerous suicidal cult. In fact, those people clearly demonstrated by their actions that they wanted to live, and they fought for their lives to the end.
On April the 14th, there was a major breakthrough, and that breakthrough was David Koresh's letter to me, which I promptly gave to the FBI, that said that he'd received his mission, that he was working on writing his interpretation of the 7 seals, and that everyone inside was relieved that they didn't have to die now, that the prophecies were not being fulfilled now, and that this would be resolved.
He waited 51 days, and then he said, the word came to him and said, write, and he wrote. This was brought out the day of the fire by one of the survivors. He was keeping his promise of April 14th. We believe they would have all come out safely.
What I was faced with was a situation where the negotiators said, we think we have reached an impasse. Nobody else is coming out voluntarily. We looked at the entire situation and we made the best judgment we could. I'm very satisfied that in the information furnished to me by the FBI, I was informed